Since it felt like every other day, I didn't have any high hopes for my day getting up, managing my antique shop, and looking for activities to occupy my remaining time. Made the routine as boring as it could get, not in the loud, sobbing sense, but rather the quiet, lingering kind that can ambush you in the middle of a grocery aisle. Life was lonely the way it had been for the past few years of all places. Walmart was the scene of the incident. The shelves were piled high with cereal boxes, as I filled my cart with my usual groceries, my mind operating automatically, and I wasn't particularly interested in cheap cleaning supplies. Nothing was grabbing my attention. Not at all. My life was going well. I was lonely, but not unhappy since Dan left. 7 years ago. I've been living alone after getting divorced. I felt as though he had disappeared from my life, despite what they call it. We were a team one day, and not the next time passed as it always does, and I followed SU. I was no longer young when I was 57. Everyone thought I was set in my ways, and should accept whatever hand life threw me going forward. But then there was Hunter. He was just the guy at the cash register scanning my groceries, and I didn't know his name at the time, but he was unavoidable. He was tall, probably about 6'3" and with lean muscles that stretched his uniform. Just so hair that was curly and unkempt, as if he had just gotten out of bed, a face that could have been sculpted by Michelangelo himself, a jawline so sharp it could cut glass-piercing green eyes that seemed to see right through people, and a smile. Oh, that smile. He was unlike any cashier I had ever seen. I was affected by it, ma'am. Are you okay? I was roused from the trance. I was unaware. I had entered by his smooth and deep voice, my cheeks flushed as I blinked. Realizing that I had been staring for probably too long, I quickly looked away and concentrated on the cereal in my cart, as though it were the most fascinating thing in the world, muttering, "Oh, sorry." He laughed quietly as he kept looking through my belongings. It happens all the time, so don't worry with my heart pounding. I looked up at him from under my lashes, even though I wasn't a shy person. There was something about him that brought back my schoolgirl feelings. As I gave him another glance, my skin became hot, and my heartbeat accelerated. God, that charm, that youthful energy. He was beautiful. He exuded it. And here I was, a middle-aged woman with graying hair experiencing OT. I hadn't had in a long time. As he finished bagging my groceries, my fingers fumbled with my wallet. I couldn't stop picturing him. I felt both ashamed and thrilled as his hands, body, and touch sent a surge of heat through me. Years had passed since I had actually dated a man, and now my head was racing with ideas I dared not voice that were brewing. Deep inside, I gave him a tip in addition to the money. Even though I don't usually do that, I felt compelled to give him something this time, even if it was only an additional $5. He grinned and said, "Thank you," keeping his gaze on mine for a moment longer than was necessary. My stomach flipped, and I felt a pull of warmth in places I had assumed had long since cooled. The cool evening breeze hit my face, but it did nothing to quench the fire that had ignited inside of me. I swallowed hard, muttering something in response, then gathered my bags and left the store as fast as my feet would carry me. That was all I could think about Hunter. I grabbed the steering wheel firmly and got into my car. "Take control of yourself," I muttered to myself, Danielle. But the more I tried to ignore the thoughts, the more real they became. His voice, his body, his face. I was haunted. By it, I was a complete mess when I got home. I tried watching TV to divert my attention, but it kept slipping back to him. Every look, every grin, every movement of his hands, while he looked through my groceries. It was all I could think about, and all of a sudden, I was a woman again, with needs and desires that had been suppressed for so long that I had forgotten they existed. I was no longer a 57-year-old widow before I knew it. I had no idea what had hit me. The groceries had been left on the kitchen counter while I was upstairs in my bedroom. I was not alone in my thoughts. As I lay on my bed and stared at the ceiling, I was there with Hunter. I didn't care tonight, even though I knew what I needed, and hadn't given myself this kind of indulgence. In such a long time imagining my hands were his, I placed a pillow behind my head and let them fall. I muttered Hunter's name to myself as my fingers moved, thinking of his green eyes, slender arms, and the effortless way he moved behind the counter. What had I done? This was completely different from me. For heaven's sake. I was an adult woman, not a teenager. But the more I tried to tell myself that this was wrong, the more I wanted it. That evening I yearned for him. I didn't get much sleep. I could always see his face, hear his voice, and feel his touch. When I closed my eyes, it was frustrating. I usually went grocery shopping twice a month. There was no reason to go more frequently, but all of a sudden I came up with reasons. I could have used some fresh fruit eggs, a fresh pack of coffee detergent, or anything else that would get me back to that register. Every trip to Walmart became the highlight of my week as the days flew by. Hunter made me feel alive just by being around him. So even though this foolish obsession over a boy half my age was ABD, I didn't care. I felt something I hadn't felt in years when I spoke to him, and even exchanged those brief smiles. But then one day everything changed. Another calm day at the antique shop came to an end in the late afternoon since I didn't actually need anything that day. I told myself I wouldn't be going to Walmart, but at 400 p.m. Before I knew it, I was in the car heading to the store as my hands began to itch when I saw him at the far register. My heart began to race a little. As I walked through the sliding doors, I couldn't resist stealing glances at him as I maneuvered through the aisles, grabbing random items to justify my presence in the nearly deserted store. Hunter looked particularly good that night. His slender body moved with that same effortless grace, and his curls appeared a bit messier, as though he had been running his hands through them. He was wearing a t-shirt that clung just enough to highlight the definition in his arms and chest. The store was almost deserted. By the time I got to the register, I put my belongings, a few bananas, on the belt. He tried to look casual while scanning a bag of chips and another bottle of wine. But each time his hands touched the objects, I could feel the same warmth. Building inside of me, I saw him look at the clock on the wall behind the register, as he gave me the receipt with a heavy clunk. He closed the drawer and sighed softly in relief. His voice was warm and familiar, as he smiled and said, "You're my last customer. Get to leave at last." I nodded, a weird sense of anticipation causing my heart to race. A rash thought was developing inside of me before I even realized what I was doing. I followed Hunter, feigning to search through my purse as he packed up his belongings and headed for the door. This was my opportunity as Hunter approached the parking lot with his keys jangling in his hand. The streetlights outside were buzzing to life, and the sky had grown darker. I watched from a distance, looking at the lines of cars until I saw mine. And then I leaned over the hood and opened it, figging to check the engine. I muttered, "Damn thing won't start loud enough for Hunter to hear," who was only a few feet away. As I had hoped, he slowed down and looked over his shoulder. "Are you all right, ma'am?" With sincere concern in his voice, he called out. I started trying to figure out why I was frustrated. My car has been acting strangely for the past week, and now it won't start. I huffed in exaggerated frustration and crossed my arms. Hunter's brows were furrowed as he tilted his head. "Man, I would really appreciate it if you would let me have a look." Even in the open, his presence was overwhelming as he walked closer. Parking area, he leaned over the engine, inspecting the tangle of pipes and wires, curls falling over his forehead, and I took a step back. I looked at him without shame, observing the movement of his muscles under his t-shirt. He stood up after a moment and wiped his hands on his jeans. "Don't worry. I know a guy who can tow it and fix it." I sighed quietly in relief. "Hunter. Thank you." I was unsure of my next course of action. I swear that when he smiled, everything seemed a little more hopeful. "If you want, I can drive you home," before I could stop them. They said, "I'm parked right over there. That would be fantastic." He opened the passenger door for me and walked me to his spotless black sedan with leather seats as I slipped in. The room, was filled with the subtle aroma of his cologne and leather. It was euphoric. My mind was elsewhere, whirling with thoughts, possibilities and desires I'd buried for too long while he drove, and we engaged in light conversation about the weather, his job and my antique shop with my heart racing. I turned to face him as we pulled into my driveway. "Do you want to have a drink with us?" Despite the emotional upheaval, I asked in a casual tone. Hunter hesitated for a moment, his hand still on the steering wheel. Then he smiled at me with that effortless smile that made my knees weak. "Of course, why not?" I pointed to the living room. "As soon as we entered my home, get comfortable and I'll get us some beer." As I vanished into the kitchen, he sank into the couch and peered around with mild curiosity. With my hands shaking a little from excitement, I handed him a cold bottle of beer after taking 2 out of the refrigerator. I grinned perfect, he said, removing the cap with a practiced flick. "I hope you like lagers." I paused to admire him as he sipped. His beer while leaning back into the cushions. I wanted more, but he seemed so at ease and content every night since I first saw him. I wanted his eyes on me, not just in a friendly way, but in the way I had dreamed with a beer still cold in my hand. I excused myself and slipped into my room. I stood in front of the mirror in my room's dim light, biting my lip as I considered my next course of action. I undressed and grabbed a silk robe that fit me perfectly and left just enough room for the imagination. It wasn't exactly modest, but then again, modesty wasn't what I was going for tonight. I let the fabric hang over my shoulders and tied the sash, loosely letting it fall open just enough to reveal what was underneath when I returned to the living room. Hunter was still drinking his beer, his eyes fixed on the television, and I walked in casually acting, not to notice him at first. "Where's that remote?" I muttered as I slowly leaned forward to look under the coffee table for it. As I dug through the mess, the robe slipped a little. Hunter gave me a fleeting glance out of the corner of my eye, a slight change in his gait, but it was enough to make my heart race. I stood up straight, holding the remote, and gave him a teasing grin. He cleared his throat and shifted uneasily in his chair. "You have a nice place," I said. "Thank you," and sat down on the couch next to him. "Do you always go out of your way to help old ladies with their cars?" I asked, keeping my voice light, making sure to sit close enough that our legs touched as he ran a hand through his curls. Hunter laughed, "Only those who leave a good tip." I laughed, and it sounded more real than I had anticipated. God, he was charming, and I felt desirable for the first time in a long time. As if just perhaps this attractive young man thought of me as more than just an elderly woman. I wasn't going to let it slip away as we sipped our beers in cozy silence for a while. The tension between us was thick. The shift, the slow burn, of something exciting and dangerous building between us. Hunter moved next to me, his thigh grazing mine once more, and he remained there this time with my heart racing. I turned to him and grinned. "I appreciate the ride," with my hand lightly resting on his arm. I whispered, "Hunter, I haven't had company in a long time." The world seemed to pause for a moment as he gazed at me. "You're welcome," he said, in a low, unsure voice, and I realized then that this was my opportunity. Hunter's uncertain yet inquisitive gaze lingered on me as I slowly moved my hand down his arm. My heart hammered against my ribs. I could tell he was feeling something because of the slight catch in his breath. I leaned closer as he moved on the couch, allowing the silk robe to slide a bit further. I said in a barely audible whisper, "You don't have to go just yet." Hunter looked at me with that same anxious but curious look, and he gulped his atoms. Apple-bobbing his eyes showed a hesitancy that suggested he was conflicted. I hoped that God wanted me between reason and instinct, between right and his will. Danielle started, but I silenced him by lightly pressing a finger to his lips. I smiled softly and whispered, "Just stay a little while." Longer he sat there waiting, watching me, and did not move when I withdrew my hand. I grabbed his beer and set it down on the coffee table before moving in closer. I could smell his scent: clean laundry, fresh pine, and a faint hint of something familiar, while my heart was pounding so hard that I could feel a rush in my ears land home. May have made my head spin. My fingers lingered on his forehead for a fraction of a second as I reached up and brushed a curl away. His breath caught once more, and I noticed that his expression had changed, with something flickering behind those eyes. His nervousness had given way to curiosity. I had finished waiting and was enchanted. I slowly and deliberately pressed my lips to his cheek as I leaned in and felt his soft stubble for a brief moment. He tensed, but the tension vanished as soon as he released his breath. "You're very attractive." It wasn't a lie. I whispered in all significant respects. He was a Greek god. Hunter's head twitched, and our faces were inches apart in an instant for a heartbeat. I hesitated, allowing him to pull away, but he didn't. Rather, he drew closer to me, imitating my movements as though something inside of him had finally given out. He reached up and placed his hand on my back. I didn't mind that the robe slipped open a little more. I desired for him to see me as I truly was. I wanted him to know how I felt. I separated from him and pressed my forehead to his. "I've been waiting so long for this moment, Hunter," with emotion in my voice. I whispered, "I want you to understand how much you mean to me. I'd like to feel intimate with you." He needed no more encouragement than that. He lifted me off the couch and held me tenderly. We were concentrating on one another and our relationship with a gentle smile. We gave into the moment wholeheartedly and completely after Hunter briefly withdrew his eyes, searching mine, as if to confirm one last time that this was real. For the first time in years, I realized that this was what I had been waiting for, and time seemed to blur as the world shrank to just the two of us, lost in the heat of the moment and in each other.